All right, good evening for the Thursday, April 6th, 2023 Board of Education special meeting. We'll start with the roll call from Ms. Haas.
Mrs. Bukta?
Here.
Mr. Rogers?
Here.
Mrs. Selly?
Here.
Mrs. Reynolds? Mr. Nickram?
Here. And we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. And customary to every board meeting, we start with our vision and mission statement. The vision reads, thank you. Vision reads, achieving distinction in all that we do, while the vision statement reads, cultivate an inclusive, high-performing culture of growth and community. All right, and we'll be moving on to item 2 tonight under personnel. Dr. Abbott, please.
Yes, we do have a resignation request effective at the end of this school year. That is for Melissa Steffen, 1.0 FTE math teacher at Fort Atkinson High School.
All right, and we will need, we'll just need a motion on that.
Yep. Please vote.
Move to accept the resignation.
Second.
All right, we have a motion by Ms. Selly, a second by Mr. Rogers. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And those opposed? All right, moving on to retirement option.
Yes, we do have before the board this evening. We would appreciate you considering extending the retirement deadline. There are 2 parts of the resolution. The first is required by Certified Staff Handbook. The deadline, as you're well aware, was February 28th. We would like to extend that to 4 o'clock next Tuesday afternoon. We would also like to offer the one-time incentive to those certified staff members who may change their mind and consider early retirement or retirement, again, notifying us no later than 4 o'clock next Tuesday. We think given the situation with the operating referendum failure that we'll be talking about at length this evening, that that's an opportunity that some staff might want the opportunity to consider as the board considers further actions and steps later this evening.
So the program is the same as what it was, just simply extending a deadline.
It's exactly the same. The first part of the resolution handles the handbook language, which changes the date from what was terminating February 28th and moves it to April 11th at 4 o'clock. And the second part looks familiar because it's exactly what you took action on earlier this winter related to the one-time incentive for certified staff.
Be it resolved that the Board of Education approve a one-time extension for eligible certified staff to declare their intent to retire at the end of the 2022-23 school year to April 11th, 2023 at 4 p.m. This recommendation will allow all eligible certified staff who declare their intent to retire by April 11th, 2023 to receive any and all benefits available to them under Section 17 Post-Employment Benefits of the School District of Fort Atkinson's Certified Staff Employee Handbook. Be it further resolved that the Board of Education extend the deadline for certified staff to declare their intent to retire at the conclusion of the 2022-23 school year for the one-time retirement incentive in the amount of $12,000 for certified staff who have reached age 55 by August 31st, 2023, and have completed a minimum of 10 years of service in education to no later than April 11th, 2023 at 4 p.m. I so move.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion by Ms. Rogers, a second by Ms. Bukta, and a roll call, please, Ms. Haas.
Mrs. Bukta?
Yes.
Mr. Rogers?
Yes.
Mrs. Selly?
Yes.
Mr. Nickram?
Yes. All right, moving on to the non-instruction part this evening, the review of the referendum and election results. Dr. Abbott.
I think it's okay. This evening, we are here to provide the Board of Education and our larger community an update on our recent operational referendum results and potential next steps for the board to consider, given that the referendum did not pass. Mr. Demarath, our Director of Business Services, and I will be providing the board with several items this evening. The first, an overview of the referendum results. Secondly, an update on the district's current financial position. Third, cuts that have already been made to offset known financial shortfalls. Item 4, to provide options for the board to consider as next steps given the failed operational referendum. And then item number 5, next steps and timelines the administration would suggest given the advisement that we received from the board later this evening. Mr. Demerath and I will share our presentation this evening. Then we would be happy to respond to any questions you might have and engage in whatever discussion you would like us to participate in at the end. First, our referendum results. As the board and the community is aware, our November operational referendum failed by a margin of 6.6%. This week's April operational referendum failed by a margin of 15.9%. Given that our financial needs are not going away, and we do not have faith that our state legislature will adequately fund public education in the upcoming biennial budget, a need to seek another operational referendum is a known. Given state statutes, school districts are only able to ask a referendum questions on regularly scheduled elections. Given there is no regular election next November, the first opportunity for us to return to the voters with another operational referendum question will be in February of 2024, the primary election for the April 2024 regular election. The second opportunity would be that regular election of April of 2024, and then the final opportunity in 2024 would be the November regular election. Now, please also, as a review, keep in mind that districts are only allowed to ask 2 referendum questions within 1 calendar year. As such, while there are 3 election dates in 2024, the board could only have a referendum question on 2 of the ballots, one of those in spring, and then as needed, potentially in fall, depending on the success of a spring referendum question. And at this point, I'll be glad to turn things over to Mr. Demerath, as he will discuss our current financial position given our failed referendum.
Thank you. You may recognize this graph from earlier this year when we discussed going to referendum as well as within our referendum communications. What is shown here is what our projected deficit would be if the referendum was not successful. This is where the $6.8 million deficit from our referendum communications came from. Knowing the deficit we were facing, we knew that along with the referendum question, we still had to right-size our staff to our declining enrollment and make cuts to get through the 4 years of the referendum that was proposed. So alongside running the referendum campaign, we were also working to fulfill that promise to the community. The board may also recall this slide from various presentations over the past couple of years. These were the strategies that the Board of Education asked us to use to meet our strategic priorities. The bottom 3 are no longer in play as they referred to the capital referendum, an operational referendum, and the federal ESSER funding, which has been allocated over the past couple of years. The 3 highlighted strategies were the ones that we focused on in working to fulfill the promise to the community of making cuts alongside the referendum. This included right-sizing our staff to enrollment, evaluating all vacancies for attrition or restructuring, and analyzing current programming. This work even started a year ago as we prepared the current year budget prior to any operational referendum. Coming into this current fiscal year, we attritioned 7 full-time positions across the district, totaling nearly $540,000 in savings. As the board considered referendum options, we knew that to make it through the 4 years of an operational referendum, we would have to come up with a cumulative total of $5 million in cuts through attrition, strategic abandonments, or new revenue from the state. This was a known going into the referendum and the work we have done to this point to fulfill that promise to the community. You may recall that one of the strategies this board employed and to make this happen was to offer a retirement incentive to certified and support staff to allow for positions to be attritioned rather than having to lay people off. This is the work we have been doing since January. We can share with you tonight the results of that work. Through retirements and resignations, we're able to cut 15 and a half positions across the district, totaling an estimated annual recurring savings of $1.2 million. These were not shared as cuts prior to this evening, as were awaiting the outcome of the referendum to verify that these vacant positions were the most strategic ones to attrition for the district to achieve the expectation that we avoid layoffs and save $5 million over the next 4 years. In addition, the support staff retirement incentive window is still open for a week and a half, and that contributes to what was possible for attritions. Tonight, our administrative team is bringing forward these vacancies as initial cuts for the 2023-24 school year, as they allow us to save approximately $1.2 million by not filling vacant positions. While some restructuring and reassignments will be necessary with these cuts, these positions are the ones that we are now planning to cut to fulfill our promise to the community to cut a cumulative $5 million over the next 4 years. As a result of what I just shared, we believe we have fulfilled that promise to the community to address what would have been a 4-year cumulative deficit of $5 million had the referendum been successful. We have done this by leveraging those strategies the board asked us to follow that I mentioned earlier, right-sizing to enrollment through attritions and restructuring, as well as evaluating programs for possible strategic abandonment. So where does this now leave us after the failed referendum as far as a deficit for next year? You can see here that through the $1.2 million in cuts, as well as a negotiated health insurance renewal that's lower than what was projected, we decreased the projected deficit for next year by over $1.4 million. As a result, that new $5.4 million deficit is now our starting point for our next conversation about advisement from the Board of Education on additional cuts going into next school year due to the failed referendum. As was mentioned earlier, a referendum prior to next spring to address this deficit is not possible. So outside of additional funding from the state to increase the district's revenue, the only way to manage this $5.4 million deficit for next year is on the expense side.
We'll move next to provide the board with potential options to consider as to provide us guidance as to how you would like us to move forward given our impending budget shortfall. With the knowledge that we would still be making cuts to address the $5 million cumulative deficit over the next 4 years, the increasing lack of support for an operational referendum since November signals to us that our community wants us to reduce programming and wants us to reduce services even more. While there may be various reasons for decreased support for additional operating funds, the bottom line is that without these funds, we cannot provide our current level of programming and services, and therefore, the nearly 16-point spread in votes tells us that further cuts are needed. We have 3 options to share with the board this evening, with room, of course, for other options that you may believe are viable that we can discuss at the conclusion of our presentation. What we are looking for this evening is advisement from you as the board as to which option you would like the administration to pursue. It will then be up to the administrative team to engage strategies to meet your selected option. As the administration works toward the option advised by the board this evening, we will be looking to engage these strategies that we have been using these past few years. Further strategy conversations can occur as we do this work and share it with the board at a later date. This evening, it is about giving the administration direction on which option to begin working toward. With that preface, as with the use of fund balance as a feature with all of our options this evening, in an effort to get the next possible election date a year from now, I'll invite Mr. Demarest back to the podium to talk a little bit more in depth about fund balance and why it is needed.
In simple terms, fund balance is just like someone's savings account. It is set aside to meet unforeseen expenses, strategic future investments, or in our case, to meet cash flow needs throughout the year based on when our revenue is received. This graph is the operating balances graph that is a part of every month's board treasurer's report. What is highlighted here is our low point in cash reserves during the year. Because our two main sources of revenue are state aid and taxes, the timing of receiving funds from those two sources dictates how we utilize our operating reserve, or fund balance. Because taxes are not collected until December and sent to the district until January, we're over 6 months into our fiscal year before we see a dime of our budgeted taxes for the year. On the state aid side, we receive a payment in September for a quarter of our annual aid amount, but then do not receive the next payment until early December. Therefore, between the start of the school year and the beginning of December, we utilize our fund balance to meet our operating expenses over those first 3 months of the school year. To make an analogy to a home budget, this would be like getting about 1/8 of your yearly pay in September and then having to supplement with your savings account to pay your bills until your next paycheck in December. This is the cash flow issue that all districts in Wisconsin face and the primary reason to have a fund balance. The question is often asked, how large of a fund balance is recommended? What is shown here is the answer to that question on the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction's website. I won't read everything here, but rather refer to the underlined section at the bottom as a perfect summary of how much fund balance a district should carry. It states, an amount sufficient that short-term borrowing for cash flow could be avoided and would also allow the district to set aside sufficient assets to realize its longer-range goals. The short-term borrowing comes in based on the cash flow issues I just shared. As a result of the failed referendum, our ability to set aside sufficient assets for longer-range goals at this point is no longer possible, but was part of our referendum strategy to limit the amount of funding we asked the community for. Locally, in order to avoid short-term borrowing, our fund balance at the end of the year would need to be in the $10 million range. This graphic illustrates where our fund balance stood at the beginning of this year and where it would stand at the end of 2023-24 should the total $5.4 million remaining deficit for next year be addressed through the use of fund balance. As is highlighted here, with no additional cuts, at the end of next year, our fund balance would be just over $8.3 million, or $1.7 million short of that $10 million mark needed to avoid short-term borrowing. If we look 1 year further, if no additional cuts are made and no future operational referendum is secured, we would expend nearly all of our fund balance by the end of the 2024-25 school year, leaving us with no funds to cover operational shortfalls or emergency expenditures. With that background, Dr. Abbott will walk you through each of the 3 options and their impacts.
The first option for moving forward is to enact the cuts that we have already planned to the total of $1.2 million through attrition and restructuring without enacting additional cuts. These were the reductions that were already promised to the community as part of the referendum and would obviously necessitate an operational referendum in 2024. Given that no additional cuts would be made in this option would require the largest operational referendum dollar amount in 2024. The impacts of this option were, as we discussed earlier, there would be no active layoffs of employees, some increased class sizes and movements of students amongst our elementary schools, as well as the reassignment of some duties across our staff members. This option would require a significant use of our fund balance to meet the deficit next year, resulting in the need to short-term borrow to meet our operational expenses. In option 2, this leads us to what we are proposing for you to consider this evening as well. To not only cut the $1.2 million in known vacancies, but to also cut an additional $1.7 million to get to a point where we have the fund balance that is sufficient and to get us into that $10 million range. That would be a total of $2.9 million in cuts for next year. This option responds to the community's direction through the referendum results to reduce operating costs through cuts to programming and services. This option would also necessitate an operational referendum in 2024 for long-term financial viability. However, the amount of that referendum would be reduced from option 1 due to those additional operational cuts. The differences in the impact of this option compared to that of option 1 is that it will require active layoff of staff members. It will further increase class sizes, it will reduce course offerings and programming, and result in more movement of elementary students across our schools. It will also involve a significant reassignment of our staff duties across all of our employee groups. However, as just discussed, this option has the potential to avoid short-term borrowing and the associated costs by having a fund balance that is within that $10 million range. As strategies are enacted under this option, there will likely be other impacts. The third option we wanted to share with you this evening would be enacting what was proposed under options 1 and 2, as well as making additional cuts beyond that $2.9 million, if desired by you, the Board of Education. This option would be a stronger response to the direction received from the community through Tuesday's failed referendum. Again, even if the board desired us to cut all $5.4 million for next year, unless state-imposed funding mechanisms for public education in Wisconsin changes fully to meet our long-term needs, an operational referendum in 2024 would still be necessary. Just like option 2, this option would require active layoffs of staff, but would also be more significant based on the amount the board determines for us to cut, which would result in a significant reduction in course offerings, eliminating programs, high class sizes, and much larger implications for restructuring. While this option would have the least impact on fund balance, it would also begin to compromise our ability to meet our strategic plan goals. Which brings me back to where Mr. Nickram began our meeting with our vision, achieving distinction in all we do, and our mission, cultivate an inclusive, high-performing culture of growth and community. And of course, as the board and our community are fully aware, our community has responded very favorably to our new results-driven strategic plan and the work of our students and our staff toward attaining those goals in the years that lie ahead. As we continue to understand the results of the operational referendum, we also want to be clear that moving forward, this trajectory of our district is required. As a recap, these are the 3 options that we just reviewed, with the opportunity for the board to suggest other options altogether. These are the options that we, as an administrative team, have prepared for the board's consideration as elected officials. This is the time for the board to discuss these options, to suggest other options, ask questions, and provide us with the direction to move forward based on your personal interpretation of the referendum outcome. And with that, we'd be happy to hear your discussion or respond to any questions that you might have.
Tell me again, how much would we have to dip into our fund balance if we take option 2?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
I'm looking at option 2. It says lesser use of fund balance. My question is, do you have a sense of how much we'd have to lose the fund balance? Option 2?
To stay at that $10 million mark, it would be about $3.7 million.
And we took option 3, am I reading it right? Then we wouldn't have to use any of the fund balance?
If we took option 3, which would be, it depends how much beyond the 2.9 million the board would want to go. If the full 5.4 million were requested to be cut, that would not use fund balance for next year.
We've been able to avoid short-term borrowing recently.
Yeah, I think the last time we short-term borrowed was probably around 2013 or so, when we paid off a note to the WRS. We short-term borrowed for less than a month to cover that time in November.
What is our debt balance now? I mean, do we have, we don't have any short-term debt. What is the long-term debt that we have?
We have the $16.5 million that we just borrowed for the $22 million worth of projects. And then there is also some debt remaining from the $3.2 million in energy projects at the high school from the prior year.
The high school's paid off though, right?
The high school building, yeah.
Previous to 2015, have we done much short-term borrowing before that?
Say that again?
Previous to, you indicated we short-term borrowed for a month or so in 2015, but previous to that, was that a common practice?
Not that I'm aware of. I believe later in my predecessor's tenure, there wasn't any short-term borrowing. I know early in his tenure, which was like the 80s, there was quite a bit, but
Right.
So with the first two options, we would be dipping into that fund balance, right? But the third one, we're not quite sure.
the first two options, we would dip into the fund balance. The third option would be depending how far the board would desire for us to go towards that 5.4 million total.
So in option two, just to be precise, we'd be dipping into fund balance, but it would not take us below the $10 million threshold.
Right.
That would necessitate a short-term borrowing, which I think is maybe where these questions are.
Say that one more time, please.
Yeah, say that again.
So we would need to augment those cuts with some monies from the fund balance, but the fund balance would still have a remaining amount of $10 million or enough to avoid short-term borrowing. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you go
Yes.
back to the slide that has the fund balance impact? Yeah, that one. So right now, we have 13.7.
Yep.
Oh, I'll be generous and round up the $8,000. So we have 13.7. So we're saying that we have 6.8 million in deficit because,
5.4 now.
well,
After,
that's with the
After-
1.2.
Yeah, with the 1.2, right.
And so if you're taking option two as 2.9, that includes the 1.2, so it's really
Correct.
1.7 that you'd be taking off the 5.4. So, sorry, am I throwing out too many numbers? 6.8 minus 2.9, right?
What's that?
6.8 million minus 2.9 is option two. If we
Right.
take it from where we are
Right.
today,
From where we are today,
Right.
yes.
Correct.
so it's the 6.8, so we'd still be at 4.1 million, looking at taking that out of the 13.7. So that would take us below that $10 million threshold. But you're saying
Well-
that's like a,
the one, I'm missing
no,
the
I
1.2. Let's,
I think we're getting perhaps just maybe a number. Could you describe what this figure is showing explicitly? Because the 8.2 includes the 5.4 being taken
Taken
from
out.
the fund reserve already.
Correct. So the 8.2, we'll call it 8.3 million there in remaining fund balance is after if all 5.4 million is taken out of fund balance. So the 1.7 would get us to that $10 million threshold.
So this is
Understand.
option,
Okay.
this is representative of option one, which is making no additional cuts.
Right.
If we make $1.7 million of additional cuts, the 8.3 plus the 1.7 gets us to the 10 million.
Right.
Because then you
Okay.
would be raising up as opposed to
Right.
furthering it.
That, the
Okay.
additional cuts would be in addition to what this particular figure is representing.
yeah, that's right. I was trying to go off of current year to see where
Right,
we,
yep, I see what you were doing there.
Well, I think we need to avoid any significant borrowing. You get in that, option, it just snowballs and
so you're saying option one. You're not suggesting that, but what you're saying is the option one is, that's a bit of a slippery slope in your
yeah,
opinion.
yeah, slippery slope is a good way to phrase it.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I agree with that too.
So saying that option 1 would not be something that you guys would consider. It'd be more option 2 or 3.
Right.
Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But we also have to make sure that, it's like a double-edged sword here. We have to look at it being fiscally minded, as well as making sure that our kids are being educated in a way that's appropriate and doable as well. Also looking at the staff as well, because, could you define for me explicitly staff reassignment?
No. It would depend on what the cuts to staff were, which are not determined. So.
Well, not, I guess, sorry, I didn't mean like by names or jobs or anything. I'm saying like, would you have to, would current staff for the next following year have to have different job descriptions in the sense of they would have to either add or be replaced? You know what I mean? Like, are they gonna add on more work than they currently have?
I mean, I think all of those are items that are on the table, and until
Right,
we
okay.
know exactly what it is that we're left to work with, I'm certainly not trying to evade your question. It's just very difficult for me to quantify that. In general, I think that you would see some teachers in different positions than they are now, or other support staff in other positions than they are now, or in other parts of the organization. I think that you could see some supervisory duties that are being reallocated from support staff to perhaps certified staff situations. I think you could see some service model changes for student supports, moving to different staff than they are currently allocated to. I mean, I think that list sort of continues depending on where those cuts are made. I'm not sure I'm helping, or if you have a follow-up question, I can try to better answer it for you.
I guess I'm just looking at it like more in a teacher view as well as a student view. Like, what would it look like with resources, and are teachers gonna have, like, I guess we also have to think about what are some of the things that the students are, what their needs are, what are the resources that are going to be available to them, what are the jobs that the staff currently may have to increase in their duties. I guess, I don't know, I guess I'm thinking about that and putting myself into their shoes.
Well, I would say that most people who work in the organization would contend that we weren't overstaffed to begin with. Whether or not that's accurate, I suppose, is up to debate, frankly. The $1.2 million of known cuts that we described for you this evening, you can see the volume of people that it takes in order to attain a number of 1.2 million. So in addition to that list, 1.7, you can sort of get an idea of volume there. And I don't think that making additional cuts like that would come with anything other than additional work spread for others across the organization. Not a reason not to, but I don't think, those needs are going to change just because we have fewer staff in the district.
So the or the 500K that was cut through 7 positions, and then another 1.2 through 15 and a half. So you're talking the equivalent of that again, doubling that.
Yeah, right.
So 22,
It
rough numbers.
varies a
22
little bit just based on position, based on
Right.
what those numbers total
But
to,
let's say
but yes.
20 additional positions and cuts.
Yeah, see, as Mr. Demerath was describing, that original 500,000, like, we knew in order to get to a referendum, we thought the community would be able to support, which is what we had this week, that we needed to show due diligence in making cuts along the way. Therefore, the 500,000, over the last year and a half, and then this additional 1.2 moving forward. So, I mean, there's no use living in the past, but we knew we needed to come up with, a cumulative $6+ million in savings just to keep our referendum number what it was. And that's what we've produced for you to this point.
Besides cuts, what are other options in terms of facility use, facility maintenance, combination of services for things? I mean, besides personnel, are there any other options?
So what we're looking for this evening is you to provide us guidance on what option and for what those dollar amounts might be. And then our work is to gather different strategies and try to figure out how it is that we can attain those numbers. Simply put, when 80% of an organizational's costs are based on salaries and benefits, of which all schools are for the most part, that's where most of it is going to land. So, trimming a little piece here, like we talked about at the last board meeting, I think at quite length, like this isn't a haircut.
Yeah.
So yes, I think there are some things that would be engaged as strategies to perhaps find, for lack of a better word, efficiencies or niceties that perhaps are no longer available. But in reality, to get any real traction in these numbers, it's about people.
It comes from people, yeah.
Do you have a recommendation of which option?
We knew that you were going to ask that. In
You
fact,
were
we
right.
said Chris is going to ask. I'm going to dodge that a little bit because, we have our interpretation of what the voters said in November and then what they said this week. And I'm guessing we're sitting in very similar spots as you, or perhaps even a little more connected to, it's hard to even have the conversations that we're having. But I think that's where we need to know your thinking so that we continue to all be on the same page and we're all continuing to work in the same direction.
Well, I don't think we can assume we're gonna have any better luck next year than we did this year. That's the assumption. So I'm looking at option 2. Option 3 seems a little too drastic for me.
But with option 2, we still need to go to referendum again.
With
you know?
all of them, you
With
will.
all of them,
Yeah.
we still need to, so. This is tough.
Well, here's my thinking on this, right? So we have obviously 3 options in front of us. We can sit here and say, hey, what about this? What about this? What about this? But Dr. Abbott, 75 or 80% of this dollar amount is coming from people, right? So the way I look at this is option number 1, I think we can all agree on, is probably not great for us long term, right? Least effect, I guess maybe you could argue least effect on the children, but also financially not prudent. Option number 2, in my opinion, is a best of both worlds a bit. We're using lesser of the fund balance, which means obviously that is good for us. Option number 3, from day one, obviously I've been a proponent of the strategic plan, and that is in direct competition with that. I think if we go further to option number 3, the things that we've been working on for the last 2.5 years or so kind of go by the wayside, and we have some real decisions to make here. So in my opinion, option number 2, given the 3 options, unless someone's got a better idea in front of us here, I think option number 2 is where I'm landing right now. Obviously, I welcome all, thoughts and opinions on this here.
Option 2 keeps us at a fund balance of $10 million. That's where the 1.7 came from.
That's where the 1.7 came from.
And option 3 is it's a spectrum, because it's saying keep the fund balance at 10 million and maybe a little bit more. So that's a predetermined. That's where I was asking about the services, because I agree that option 1, I think we have to look long-term. And I don't think we can, I don't think a good idea is go borrow. That's, keeping your fund balance is important. That's critical. I'm kind of between option 2 and 3, only because, with the staff cuts, and then are there other, what are those other little onesie-twosie things that
Yeah.
come out of a budget that are not desirable to come out of a budget, but are really tightening that belt?
And I think we definitely have to look at that, right? Like some of these, I don't want to send panic here, but the things that we have to be looking at as a board is like, what do we do with, some of the, maybe not as big things. We're talking athletics, we're talking music, we're talking some of these things that, I'm sure some of the public is saying, hey, do we really need that in a time like this, right? So I think that's something we all got to be very real about. And I'm not sitting up here saying like, that's what I want to cut, but these are the options on the table in front of us here that we all need to consider.
But I think to Rona's point, at what point does it start to diminish?
Yeah.
Let's say field trips. Okay, no more field trips. But at what point does that start to diminish the education
Yeah.
that we're giving?
Yep.
So then you're not meeting your strategic goals. I mean, and you're potentially losing people because who wants to work in a district where there have bare walls?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, sorry, I think in my opinion, still when we're looking at these options, the strategic plan is got to be in our minds in the top one or two things here. Obviously, the finances of this district is very important, but also we have set what we're going to be doing here in strategic plan, and if we go away from that, I don't think it's smart at this point. And it seems like I'm repetitive here, but I want to let you guys know how important that is to me, and I'm sure all of you as well.
It is.
And I would just offer as well, in part of having an effective strategic plan are having qualified and excellent staff and students and families who are still wanting to come to our schools as well. So to balance all of that, just to put it into the space, option 2 and 3 is significant reductions in active layoffs of staff over the next couple of weeks. Of our staff that are remaining, we need to make sure that we continue to be a workplace that they want to be in, and that our families aren't choosing educational opportunities elsewhere, which we know is possible for people.
Yeah.
So there's nothing leading in that comment other than hoping the public understands that as well, because it's a competitive market that we're in. And as we know, customers are easier to lose than they are to gain.
But with either option 2 or 3, those additional cuts are either layoffs or possible programs. Is that correct?
It could be people, it could be programs, it could be operational expenses.
For either option. 3, obviously, 2 possibly.
Yeah, so I mean, really the difference between option 2 and 3, practically speaking, is changing the dollar amount from 1.7 more to
Okay.
whatever number it is that you come up with. The 1.7 is there just because we felt that the fund balance threshold was something to point to as a bit of a goal when it comes to, whether or not one would need to short-term borrow.
We've carried a much higher fund balance, showing in 21, 22, closer to the 14 million, the 13 million. So as a recommendation of 10 million, is that where you're comfortable?
I am, simply because the use of what was above 10 million was intended to be used in the next 4 years as part of the referendum, to keep the referendum amount where it was. So it was the long-term plan to bring that down to 10 million over the next 4 years, so that we could keep the referendum amount where it was.
That's why
That
it was
was
being
proposed.
built up so that
Right.
it could.
It was built up so that it could be used in those later years.
Okay.
Yeah, if you look historically, I mean, just generally speaking, if you look historically on what appears to be a 3-year referendum cycle is actually a multi-year referendum cycle in how that fund balance is used, because there's money here that's going to actually be used down the road, and so it's a little misleading. It's not that those sort of funds are just evaporated. They were intended to be used at the time that they were used, just like the referendum that we put before the public this week.
So hypothetically, if we went to option 2, because in each one it necessitates the operational referendum again, and that passes in 24, what does that look like? Would that kind of offset it a little bit more? Because I guess I'm trying to think, like, if we go drastic in option 3 versus option 2, but each one we still have to go back for a referendum, would we hold off a little bit being more drastic if it does pass in 24?
Well, I think one of the things that would become more known, given some of the variables that are still at play, for instance, the new biennial budget or some of those other pieces of information that are yet to come, would help us better understand what type of number we would be looking at, which would then probably drive discussion as to when to go for a referendum. Would it be in February? Would it be in April? Or would it be in November? But to think that, I would speculate to think that a person's going to go, or the district is going to go much further than that without going to referendum is probably naive. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying if you encourage like significant, even more significant cuts now, that's not going to push us out a few years. It's going to push us out maybe an election cycle, and then that number is going to be bigger because we waited to that election cycle. That's the frustrating thing here. And is not different for any other school. And, you know, this was not a good week for operational referendums. And that's, I think, going to be a reckoning for districts, is that having this fail does not mean it solves the problem long-term. Which is unsatisfying when you're looking at disrupting a district as we're talking about tonight. And then it's to what end? It's to have to like build a machine to try to sell a referendum again in the future.
I think that it's going to be disruptive to the district. I mean, you know, looking
Regardless.
at doing another, I'm just going to call it 22, you know, cuts of 22 people. I mean, doubling what we already did. I think that's going to be disruptive. But I think that's what that's what they're,
That's what was
and I'm not
voted.
saying that's what the public wants. I think the public is sick of paying for things, but that's the result of the referendum. I would be very concerned to go farther than that at this point right now, because I think that could be, that could start to create, and who knows what this will create, but I wouldn't want to start to create a place where nobody wants to work here, people don't want to send their kids here, that, you know, we have bare minimum. I think we still need to be a district of distinction, and do that creatively. So I would go for, I think option number 2 is the right option.
I think one concern I would just offer is you could certainly choose to go deeper. How deep would really determine how rushed we would need to potentially make significant structural changes in the school district. And I'm not sure within the next 2 weeks, which is what we need to consider as far as doing staff non-renewals, that, you know, you can meaningfully do that and be happy with what you think the result might be moving forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's probably a good point. We don't know how many additional people are going to take the retirement option.
And admittedly, that group is not significantly large. You know, whether or not anyone at this point chooses to take it, that won't be a significant number.
If we took option 2, could the additional retirees be part of the,
Yes. Yeah, and admittedly, that's part of why,
That's why we're
you know, and it seems super short, it's Tuesday afternoon, right? But they had this month to think about it in February, so it's sort of a last chance. And then also remember that the board was good enough to support a support staff retirement incentive, which is still open until just before your regular April meeting. So I think, you know, you may see some movement there as well. We don't need to go back, but as you see in one of the slides that we presented this evening, there's an asterisk, and it just says sort of like thus far, because we haven't, you know, heard from all of the support staff that might be considering that retirement incentive.
Do we know how many undervotes there was?
How many undervotes there were?
Do we
I feel
have?
like
I don't have it right in front. I did the other day, but I don't have it right now.
undervotes, did you say?
Undervotes, a significant number of undervotes.
There was?
I think in all of the contests on the ballot, there were a
Yes.
very significant number of undervotes.
What do you mean by undervotes?
By undervotes, people opting to vote for certain items on the ballot but not others.
Like-
Or for not all of the candidates that they could select in a particular contest.
So I'm trying to figure out in my mind, like, I know for our ballot, the referendum question was on the back. So, you know, I just wanted that, you know, in my mind, I'm thinking of, okay, you know, maybe people didn't quite know that and would have voted differently. So I'm thinking about that for possibly, 24 for the referendum then.
I think with the November operational referendum and with this referendum both being no,
Yeah.
I don't think we can be fortune tellers and say what's going to make a difference in the
Well-
future, except for asking for less money.
Yeah. Well, and being prudent with, clearly the community has said, let's start making cuts here, right? And so we're gonna have to do that.
Pretty loud and clear.
Yeah, pretty loud and clear, and even more so than they did just a few months ago. So, I think we're kind of coming to an agreement on here, and I just want to make sure, like, what, are we looking at all options of this? But I don't want to narrow in, exclusively on these three that presented in front of us. Obviously, option 4 is additional options provided by the board. But, is there anything else that we're missing as we're kind of going through this? Is there any other ideas that we have? Obviously, with 80% being staff here, do we have any other options on the table that is not being presented to us today?
Buying a lottery ticket, maybe?
Thank you.
Yeah. Does anyone have any feelings on that at all?
I don't
Yeah.
have any other.
Yeah, I think this has been presented to us enough times that, maybe not these, obviously these numbers, we're seeing it for the first time today, but we had a feeling of where this might go if it was voted down. And so I know on the back of our mind, everybody's kind of thinking where this might go. And,
I think we did more than just about any district I can think of related to communication strategy.
Yeah.
And I think at our last board meeting in particular, we were abundantly clear as to what the result would be. And to your point, Mrs. Reynolds, I think you're exactly where we were in November, which is like, hey, I think given that it grew by nearly 10% of dissenters,
Yeah, and there wasn't as
Right, I
many
mean, I think
undervotes,
that's-
so that
the
to me
message.
is like huge,
right. That's the message, as hard as it is, I think, for all of us. And I think, there was some pretty active communication out in social, almost daring us to make cuts, and,
Well, you gave us some of the communications you were receiving, so.
yeah. If you're thinking of option 2 or 3, I would just also add this to the mix, that we would need, there are certain timelines that we need to follow, and we would ask you to consider 2 additional special board meetings in April. The first being on either April 17th or 18th, given that preliminary notices of non-renewal need to be considered at your regular April 20th meeting. So what that would look like is that upon your determination of option this evening, the administrative team would work different strategies, as we've talked about, to package to that dollar amount. And then we would meet with you separately as a board to discuss the strategies in that package, as well as what positions it is that we would be looking for. Those preliminary notices of non-renewal would then be provided to staff prior to your April 20th meeting, which then you would take formal action upon. Final notices of non-renewal and staff contracts need to be considered at your May meeting, your regular May meeting, need to be addressed in May. So we would need a separate special meeting on May 8th or 9th for those final notices of non-renewal.
Okay.
And of course, in addition, we have a number of regular business items in April and May moving forward, so.
Okay.
Well, we took option 2. Is that something you can live with? I mean, I'm getting a,
It's hard to say, Mr. Rogers. I think we're all in a very difficult spot, and it's a very emotional time for so many people. And, we're in the people business, and we're in the building organization business. And for the first time, I think, of all of the people I'm glad enough to work with sitting in a room, none of us have an example of an occasion where we've gone to people and said that we're no longer going to be able to employ you moving forward. So I think it's stunning, given the methodical and deliberate forethought and prior planning we have exerted over the years to get to a point where the number we asked for was a legit number of a need. So I guess I could spend a lot of time lamenting that this evening, but for us to have to be talking about what we're talking about and talking about taking good people out of an organization where we're seeing significant improvements over the last couple of years is very difficult. But what's compoundingly difficult to that is to have more people say no this time than they did last. And I'm not even sure that's all founded on real information, given the amount of misinformation that was actively being circulated in the last couple of weeks. I think that we're going to have to show people that their lack of attention or lack of interest or lack of whatever in factual information and understanding the plight of public schools related to our state's inability or lack of desire to adequately fund us results in changing services and programs for their students in Fort Atkinson. So that's a very
Yeah, but-
long way of saying that I think
Well
people are
put,
going to need to
well put.
feel what it is that they chose not to vote for. So yes.
Well, I'll reluctantly make a motion to adopt option 2 as stated here today, with the understanding that we'll need further special meetings to implement.
Sure. If I could offer, I think if we could take advisement, some consensus advisement from you, then when we meet in our next meetings, we would have formal actions for you to adopt at that point.
So you don't want any action tonight?
We need advisement.
Yeah.
So with your consensus around, we would like you to find an additional $1.7 million. We will have technical actions for you to consider at your special meeting on the 17th or 18th.
That's my advisement, but you don't want it in the form of a motion, so take it as you will.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you for your formality.
Do we need to set a meeting for the 17th or 18th
Yes, so then we
now?
would need action on setting those 2 special meetings.
So let's do this. So let's all come in agreement on an option here, and then we can move forward on the special meeting on the 17th and 18th. So you've obviously on option
Option
2. Rona, do you have any further comments?
Yeah, I think that at this point, the best and most efficient option is to, unfortunately, giving you and the administration a very lofty responsibility of, unfortunately, making decisions that's going to have to affect our kids and our teachers, and it's not a decision that I wish to make, but it seems, if I just look at it fiscally, that's probably the most efficient at this moment.
I'm also in agreement on option number 2.
Yeah, I'm in agreement on option number 2. I don't want to start going down the slippery slope of borrowing and borrowing. I don't want to cut more than we have to, because that's going to ultimately hurt our kids. But I still want to listen to the community, and the community says to cut. So for me, option 2 is the best of all choices.
Yeah, I agree. Option 2 is the balance between looking at the future health of the district with the fund balance and taking into account that the referendum didn't pass, so we have to look for that money someplace. And unfortunately, it will be in personnel.
Option 2 it is.
Thank you for your consideration.
Yep.
So then we would need action to secure a meeting date on either September 7th, April 17th or 18th, and then also separate action for a meeting on either May 8th or May 9th.
Okay, let me just look at calendar quick here.
What time for the 17th? 5 o'clock?
If we could, I can make either, obviously, but 18th would be a little bit more available to me. But I'll make either if, if need be.
Okay.
Honestly, for me, I would prefer the 17th. I could make the 18th work, but I would prefer the 17th.
Again, what time? 5 o'clock again?
Yeah.
If that's works for people?
I mean, if we, if maybe 4:30, if that would work better for everyone, I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there as an option. I don't know if that would, or if 5 o'clock would be better.
We can make that difference in time work, so.
Is the dates okay?
Yeah, which date are we talking? Because you preferred one, you preferred the
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, if we can go on Tuesday, the 18th, that would alleviate a lot. I know it's not great for you, but
Okay.
that is
I'll make
significant schedule
that
changes for me.
motion, the
So-
18th at 5 o'clock.
Could we do the 18th at 4:30? Would that be okay?
Would that,
Because then
Okay.
that would be okay with me.
Well, is that doable for you, Cory?
Absolutely.
Okay. I'll amend the motion to 4:30.
Thank you.
so we have 4:30, the 18th, we've got the 20th, and then we need to decide either the 8th or the 9th.
Are we
Of May.
Yeah, separate
approving- are
motions,
we
so let's
sec-
do that one
okay, so
first.
Second that,
Yep. That was the second?
I seconded.
Okay. All right,
Good
so
catch.
we have a motion in front of us for an April 18th special board meeting at 4:30. Motion by Mr. Rogers, a second by Ms. Selly. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And those opposed? All right, now let's move on to the May, what are those dates in front of
May
us? here?
8th or May 9th?
So my preference on that would be May 8th.
That is potentially good with me as well.
4:30 again?
Monday, May 8th at 4:30, it would be,
Yeah, that would help me.
Okay. So move.
I'll second.
okay, we have that motion in front of us for a special board meeting on Monday, May 8th at 4:30. We have a motion by Mr. Rogers, a second by Ms. Reynolds. All those in favor?
Aye.
And those opposed? All right. Good. All right. And that is,
Yes, if I could, just before you take a motion to adjourn, I would just, on behalf of many people, like to extend a thank you to our board members for your time, work, diligence, and commitment to our referendum effort, as well as a rather difficult conversation this evening. But the direction is appreciated and very necessary, given the result. But certainly, please accept our thank you for your continued support and the work that you too have undertaken, both in November and again here in April, to do the best we could in helping provide accurate information to the community. So thank
Well,
you.
We appreciate your efforts too, and staff.
Thank you.
Not any fun, that's for sure.
yeah. Absolutely. All right, we have a motion in front of us.
Motion to adjourn?
I'll
Second.
second.
I believe we do have a motion by Mr. Rogers, a second by what I believe is Ms. Reynolds. And all those in favor?
Aye.
And those opposed? All right, adjourn at 6:03.
Congratulations on your reelection.